4. In the first 3 parts we covered what white should do against e5 from black in the English. And so now we're going to look at what happens when black responds symmetrically. So c4, c5. So there's quite a few structures that can arise from this, but we're going to be looking at c4, c5. Okay. So again, after c5, white, we're going to play g3, similar to how we played against e5. And now black can try a couple of things here. So let's look at something like knight c6 first, which is after bishop g2, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, you're going to transpose into a symmetrical line. So notice that white and black are playing the exact same move. So this is going to be called the symmetrical variation. So we're going to go over that in a second. Okay, if knight f6 on move 3 here, then knight c3, e6 is going to transpose to a different line that we're going to cover later. And if e6 immediately on move 2, then bishop d2, and again if knight f6 it'll transpose, if knight c6 it'll also transpose, and if d5 immediately, then knight f3 will also transpose, unless black decides to take this pawn, which is probably not good, because after knight a3 we're winning this pawn back by force, and this is good for white. And if black plays d4 here, now white can do a variety of things. He can either play e3 or castle, which would turn into a reverse Benoni, or white can actually play b4, which is a reversed Benko gambit. So again, all of these, white is up a tempo on the normal lines. And the Benoni and the Benko are both very playable, so being up a tempo certainly can't hurt. But if you don't like the flavor of these lines, you can simply take on d5, take on d5. And now, normally you'd want to play d4 here, but this actually only equalizes, so you want to play d3. And then knight c6, knight c3, knight f6, bishop g5, bishop e7, knight h3. So in these lines, you want to try to get your knight to f4, put pressure on d5. d4, take on f6, take on f6, knight e4. And this is okay for white, and black actually made a mistake in this game by taking on h3 and playing bishop e7, but after castle and these moves, white's probably doing quite well here. So again, it's just up to you guys what you want to play, but I'll just show you that also, just for completeness' sake, after knight f3, d4, so you can actually either play castle here, e3, or you can actually play b4 here. Okay. But those aren't really the main setups when black plays c5. So first we're going to look at what happens when there's symmetry. So again, this can transpose from various move orders, but we're just going to see what happens when black copies white. So knight c3, knight c6. So notice we got this position from an earlier move order when black plays 2 knight c6, 3 g6, and 4 bishop g7. Okay. So this is going to be the symmetrical one. And then let's quickly take a look at what happens on knight f6 on move 2. So knight f6, bishop g2, and now e6 is probably the most sensible, trying to play d5. If knight c6, then after knight c3, e6, now knight f3, d5 is going to transpose to something we'll look at later. And something else that's possible would be g6, and then again this will transpose after a3, bishop g7, rook b1. Okay, but let's look at quickly what happens if e6 or sorry, not e6. So knight f6, bishop g2, and then e6. So here, oftentimes when black is able to get this d5 move in and recapture with a pawn, we're oftentimes going to be playing a knight to f3 rather than a knight to c3, because a knight on c3 can get chased away with d5, d4 ideas. So we want to kind of try to delay the development of this knight. So knight f3, and now d5 is the main line, and this will be dealt with later. It's a different variation. And then if knight c6, castle, and d5, this will actually transpose after pawn takes, knight takes. Okay, and if black wants to play a hedgehog here with b6, now white has a very strong move at his disposal. d4, c takes, knight takes, exposing this bishop to this rook. So d5, and simply knight c3, and bishop g5. And after bishop e7, we take, castle. And notice this pawn is pinned, so castle, knight a6, and now e4. And white's just up a pawn. Okay. And if on move 5, after d4, black plays bishop b7, this actually transposes into a line of the Queen's Indian. That should be good for white, because after d5, e takes d5, knight h4, we get a pawn back, and this bishop is going to be out of play. So say, for example, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, castle, castle. Notice we're in no hurry to take this pawn on d5, because again it's pinned, so it can never move. So bishop g5, queen c7, bishop f4, queen c8, and now we finally decide to take the pawn. And notice how black's pieces are kind of huddled in the back rank. So after rook c1, d6, a3, knight d7, b4, a6, and knight e4. White has a considerable edge here. It's a Benoni type position, but his bishop is misplaced and his knights are awkward. So yeah, after b6, knight e5 is also possible. It's a good question, Zilish, actually. I will show you that as well. Knight e5 is also possible, so this would happen after knight e5. d5, queen a4 check, and then simply knight c3 here. Knight c6 is also possible, but simply knight c3, bishop b7, and castle. And this is also good for white. But I think the other lines actually promise even more of an advantage. But you can certainly play this and enjoy a slight edge. Okay, but anyway, this probably won't happen. So let's look at these lines where black plays a6. So again, d5 is like the main line, and we'll look at that in a bit, but I just want to show you this one little side thing. So castle b5. And now we're going to actually fianchetto our bishop, so b3. Because notice that if we play knight e5 in this position, black actually has this move, rook a7. And it looks very odd, but it's actually a strong move, because this rook often will come to either the d file or the b file, or even the c file, depending on what ends up being opened. And this rook is actually quite flexible on a7. Notice that since this bishop is not developed, there's no real fear of putting this rook on a7. And, you know, black can continue with bishop b7, trade the rooks off, and then the rook on the b file will be strong. And it's easier to double it on the 7th rank. Okay, so instead of this, we play b3, bishop b7, and then our idea with e3 is we want to get our queen to a safe square, so we're going to play queen e2, rook d1, and then d4. So bishop e7, for example, and then here we just play queen e2, castle, rook d1, knight e4, take. So d3 to chase the bishop away. black trades his bishops. Bishop c6. Rook a c1, d6, and now d4. Okay, and white's probably better. Because notice that black's behind in the development and we're kind of ripping open the center. Okay, so these are kind of a couple of side things. Now we're going to go to the heart of the matter, which is this symmetrical variation. Okay, so knight c3, knight c6. Okay. So in this position, we're going to play the move a3. So the idea with a3 is we're going to try to get in a very quick b4, if possible. So white's idea is to play b4 and expand the scope of this bishop by perhaps playing b5 and chasing this knight away and putting pressure on this b7 pawn. Okay, so now black has pretty much every move under the sun that he can try. So I believe there will be 8 of them in all, so we'll go through them one at a time. So a6, I'll just show you what all 8 of them are. So there's a6, there's e6, there's e5, there's a5, there is d6, there's knight f6, there's b6, and there's knight h6. Okay, so let's look at a6 first. So black maintains the copycat symmetry. And so let's see what happens. Okay, so we're going to play rook b1 to play b4. Black copies. Okay, we play b4. Take, take, and now black plays b5. Copy. Take, take. Okay, so everything's completely symmetrical. So might as well develop. Knight f3. Okay, so now black has 4 choices. He can either play d5, e5, continue copying with knight f6, or playing knight h6. Okay. If black plays a move like d6, for example, then the fact that black isn't really controlling the center can be taken advantage of. d4, bishop g4, threatening to take on f3, take on d4, so bishop e3, knight h6, so he wants to play like knight f5 here. Knight h4, opening up the bishop to this knight and also preventing knight f5. So bishop d7, h3 to stop knight g4, which would be a bit annoying. Castle, castle, knight a7, so he's trying to find this knight a better home. Knight f5, take, take. And here white should be better. White owns this open A file and can possibly penetrate at some point if this knight moves with rook a7. And this bishop on g2 is quite strong. And we're about to trade off black's strong bishop on g7. And we have better control of the center than black, so white should be for choice here. Okay, so let's see what happens when black tries to aggressively take the center with d5. Okay, so we have to probably stop d4 here, because that's a bit annoying. We don't really want to hop our knight around all over the place. So we're going to play d4 ourselves. And now e6. Okay, so if black tries to develop this bishop outside the pawn chain with bishop f5 with a gain of tempo, now we have to keep on this pawn. So rook b3. And then bishop e4, trying to defend the d pawn. Because notice we were maybe threatening knight h4 here, attacking the bishop and giving a second attacker to this pawn after we play e3. Okay, so we don't want to copy the symmetry with bishop f4 here. Oops, sorry, not bishop e3. So is e3. And then basically black is forced to give up the bishop pair here. So bishop takes f3. Bishop takes f3. And now we're attacking this pawn, so he has to play e6. and then castle, knight g7, queen d3, knight a7 to defend this pawn, and now e4. And this opening up of the center should be advantageous to white after take, queen takes d4, and queen b1. Because notice that black's pieces are all kind of awkwardly placed, and we have this threat of bishop b2. So for example, if castle, bishop b2, queen b6, and knight f6 check, should be good for white because we're threatening knight d7. If he takes, his dark squares are super weak. Okay, and if black tries to move like knight f6, just castling and castling, and it should probably transpose. So we'll look at the move e6 now. So bishop f4, rook b6, and now we play e4. Again, ripping open the position. So knight f6 is what black should play. If he takes on e4, then knight takes e4. Okay, now if he tries to win this pawn with knight takes d4, now rook c1, threatening to take here and then take on c8. So knight takes f3 check, queen takes, and then e5 to block up bishop c7, which is threatened. And now do you guys see how white wins here? So black's king is kind of unsafe, but we can make use of some tactical motifs to win material here. And the way to do it is with the always tricky queens moving sideways, queen to c3. So the idea is we're hitting this bishop on c8, we're hitting this pawn on c5, but most importantly we're actually pinning it because this bishop hangs on g7. So this should win material for white. Okay, so black would have to play knight f6, e5, knight e4, then take on e4, take on e4, knight d2. Okay, so if black takes on d4, I take on e4, and this is clearly great for white because we're getting this monster square on d6. So rather than do that, black should probably just castle. And then bishop e3, f5, ef6, bishop f6, knight e4, bishop d4, and now we decide to castle. Now e5. And now bishop h6, rook f5, queen b3, and g4 wins the exchange because this rook is trapped. Okay, so that's this one. Okay, let's see what happens on e5. Again, trying to take the center. Okay, so here we're actually going to sacrifice a pawn with d4. And now after e takes d4, we're going to hop into d5. So knight f6, pin the knight, take, bishop f4 hitting the rook, so d6. So if black doesn't play rook a8, or sorry, if black plays anything other than the move d6, white would just play bishop d6 next and prevent castling, and that would be very good for white. So d6 is pretty much forced. Now, do you guys know what white should play here? Do you guys know what white should play here? So white can actually make use of some more tactics to actually win his pawn back with bishop takes h6. So the point is, if rook takes h6, queen c1 forks this knight and this rook. Pretty stellar use of the queen to fork these two pieces. So After bishop h3, for example, castle, bishop takes g2, king takes g2, rook h5, and queen takes c. This should be much better for white. Because this king is going to be badly placed, and he's probably going to lose this pawn. Okay, so instead of that, black should probably play bishop f5, rook c1, bishop e4, bishop e2, knight e5, castle, knight c4, and here white plays the stunning bishop g5, because again, using fork motifs, bishop takes g5, queen takes d4, forking the rook and the bishop, both coming with check. And this is winning for white. So he took on f3, and take on f6, take on f6, and e takes f3. And here white's much better again, because he can potentially attack on the king side, and he's also going to win this d4 pawn. And then once d4 falls, d6 will probably also fall as well. Okay, so now let's look what happens when we maintain the symmetry and play knight f6. So now notice, after 10 moves, it's completely symmetrical. So we're going to do some more symmetry. Castle, castle, d4, d5. Okay, so far 12 moves of symmetry. And now we're going to finally break it. We're going to finally break it. And we're going to play the move knight e5. So obviously now knight e4 doesn't work. So black has a couple of choices. He can either defend this knight or take. So rook b6 is probably better. If he takes, we just take back. Knight g4, and we can just take on d5. Okay, but if rook b6, bishop g5, bishop f5, by the way, loses. Do you guys see why bishop f5 loses? So bishop e6 is forced, but bishop f5 loses because we can just take on f6 and just take on d5. And don't forget this rook is hanging. So if he takes our rook, we take his rook. Okay, so bishop e6 instead. And now knight takes c6, rook takes c6, knight takes b5, and we're just up a pawn. So up a pawn, probably good. Okay, so finally let's look at black's fourth option, which is knight h6. And so the idea is, again, black wants to get to f5 with his knight, so we should probably try to stop that. So e4. So we're stopping knight f5, and we're threatening to play d4 and build a huge center. So black probably has to try to snipe at our center immediately. Okay, so we play d4, take, knight takes, and knight f5. Okay, so he's trying to target our isolated pawn, but we can still push it. So d5, knight cd4, knight d4, knight d4, and now d6. And after knight f5, bishop g5, this pawn is a real problem for black, and white, again, should be better. Because at the very least, we can eventually take this pawn, and then this d pawn will be a big problem. Okay, so that was a3, a6. Okay, so now what happens on e6? Okay, so do you guys know what white should play here? So the point is that black simply wants to play knight e7, d5, and castle, and have a very solid position. So you guys know what white should play here? So actually white can play this move, b4, right away. Right away. So the reason why we can play b4 right away is specific to black having played e6. The point is the dark squares become very weak after e6, and b4 is a move that can take advantage of that and exploit it. So okay, let's look at a couple of options, because black can do a few things here. He can actually take this pawn with both pieces. He can take with a knight or with a pawn, because notice this pin ensures he wins his piece back. Or he can also ignore it. So let's actually look what happens if he just ignores it, first of all. So say he plays a move like d6. Well, now simply we should just take on c5 and play bishop e2. And here this is good for white, because this open b file will serve white well. Okay. So, and if black plays knight e7 or something, so rather than taking this pawn and potentially having to lose it, just simply develop knight f3. And then, okay, if he takes now, take. And now, if you want to be sane, you can play d4. And then after b takes c3, play castle. But if some of you guys want to be insane, I don't discourage being insane. You can actually play knight e4 here. And the point is, if bishop takes a1, you can actually play what move here, guys? What move? So knight d6 check is actually a bit premature. The move you want to play here is d4. And the reason is because you need to restrict this bishop from defending the dark squares. And so if black does something nonchalant, for example, like d6, well, then we have check, and I believe that's checkmate. So yeah, if you want to be insane, go for this variation, and you might get a quick 11 move, 12 move win. I bet you people would fall for that. So it's actually tough for black to defend these checks, and not to mention this. So in this position, you're only down the exchange. Black has, what, 2 extra pawns? So black has 2 pawns and then an exchange, but I'm not really sure how he defends his dark squares, so this could be interesting to try. Yeah, if he castles, I think he just gets mated though, right? Queen d2, or maybe knight f6 first, and then queen d2 to h6. It looks dire. It looks dire. Not to mention this bishop might be trapped or something. Actually, maybe on castle. Yeah, I mean, this bishop is trapped, so maybe just like bishop d2 or something. I think he has to play bishop c3 first, actually, and then king f1, and then maybe castle. But yeah, bishop h6 at the very least would win the exchange back. Yeah, it's true. But I mean, I think you probably even had better. Maybe bishop g5 is stronger, with the idea of bishop f6 and then queen c1 to h6. That might actually be stronger. This might just win, actually. So yeah, anyway, don't know if you're going to get that position, but okay, now let's go back to what happens on b4. So as I mentioned, see, if he doesn't take, we get good stuff. But okay, so let's see what happens if he takes. So there's a couple ways he can take. So he can take with the pawn. Okay, so we take. And now there's a few things black can try. So again, let's assume first that he won't take this pawn. So let's look at a couple of the other options. So say he plays knight g5, for example, knight g7. Okay, so now we're going to play b5, gaining a tempo. Then we're going to play c5, defending this pawn. Notice that we don't want to play d3 because it weakens this c3 knight, so he can play knight f3 check, right? So if d3, he plays knight f3 check, and then he takes on c3. Or he can actually simply take on c4 if he wanted to, because it actually doesn't defend the pawn, because again, the bishop could take on c3. So he has to play c5. But then after d5, cd6, queen d6, bishop a3. Now this bishop gets into the game. This is part of the reason why b4 is possible. Queen d8, knight h3, castle, and castle. And so white has 2 central pawns. active pieces, and he's not even down a pawn in this position, so this is good. Okay, now let's look the other way. He can decline it with d5, cd5, ed5, again b5. If we can get b5 in, we're doing quite well. Then d4 to stop d4. Again, bishop a3. Notice this bishop has a very nice diagonal on the a3, f8 line. Okay, and here, black has this isolated pawn, not to mention all the usual issues that he would normally have. And white's position is definitely preferable. Okay, so now let's see what happens when he takes. So, knight takes. Okay. So the obvious move, of course, would be to gain a tempo on this knight, which we're going to do with bishop a3. Okay, so notice that he can't play a5. We can just take the knight. This pawn is pinned to the rook. So he'd have to play a move like... Well, if he moves the knight, it's bad news for him, right? So let's say he takes on c3 first to double our pawns. And then after knight c6, these dark squares seem super vulnerable, right? Maybe knight f3 and e4 to stop d5 and knight f5 ideas. And then after castle, maybe h4. Just go for the gusto. So if you play like bishop d6 immediately, maybe knight f5 is a problem. But it seems that white's position is, he has a pawn's worth of compensation. And yeah, you don't want to play rook b1. Bishop a3 is much stronger. Because you want your bishop on a3 no matter what. But your rook, not necessarily on b1. So this is interesting, and I think white has good compensation for the pawn, for sure. Okay. So now let's look at the other way the pawn can be captured, which is knight takes. So the idea of this is after take, this knight is pinned. Okay. So again, we have an entertaining choice of knight b5, although I don't think it's quite as good. I can just show you what happens, but knight b5, bishop a1, queen a4, attacking the bishop. So if bishop e5, knight f3 is strong, gaining tempo, but black should probably play bishop f6 here. And then after d4, play this move a6. And then after knight d6, king f8, knight f3. It seems like black is holding, because he's up a lot of material. So rather than doing this crazy stuff, probably safer is just to play d4. And then after b takes e3, just play e3. And now this pawn's going to fall. And again, black's dark squares are a problem. So knight e7, knight e2, d5, take, and bishop a3. And now notice that, okay, white is down 2 pawns, but notice this king is trapped. So castling's illegal. And this is the point. So bishop f8, take, king takes, queen b3, castle, e4, e5, knight c3, and knight b5. So now we're getting our knight to d6, obviously. After queen b8, rook fc1, a6, knight d6, rook d8. So he's potentially threatening to sacrifice on d6, but white will make sure that never makes sense. And here bishop takes d5 was strong, because now he's rushing his rooks to the c file. And now queen c1, setting up a mating net. So after rook a8, rook c7, queen f8, queen f4, not even bothering to win the queen, king h8, rook takes, queen h6, queen g8, and rook c7. And here, black resign, because he's pretty much getting checkmated. So the cute idea is after rook f8, you play rook takes h7, queen takes f8, queen g8, knight f7, king h7, and queen h6 as mate. So mate is good. Is queen f6 better? No. Queen f6, he can take it. Queen f6 check, queen takes f6. Not better. Okay, so anyway, that's that. So again, that's the b4 line. Okay, so now let's what happens on e5. So black's trying to play a Botvinnik style setup. And now b4. Taking advantage of the fact that black's blocked in his bishop. So now c takes b4 is even worse here. d6 is pretty much forced. Because now if you take, knight takes b4, bishop a3. Okay, if knight c6, this is absolutely catastrophic. This just wins. So bishop f8 is forced. Queen a4, knight c6. And now knight b5. Although c5 is interesting, trying to establish an outpost on d6. But knight b5. Bishop a3, queen a3, knight g7. Knight d6, king f8. And now white has only sacrificed a pawn. But he has a powerful bind. It's going to be really tough for black to get his pieces out here. So this is good for white. So he has to play d6 pretty much. So this is part of the reason why you play a3, because it kind of neutralizes these Botvinnik setups, because you can get it in a very quick b4. So now we play rook b1, defend our pawn. But you could also just simply take here, and then actually take here, and play this type of structure, where, okay, you've given up the bishop, but, I mean, black's pawns are a complete mess. So after, for example, rook b7, rook b1, knight e7, d3. And now we're just going to play bishop e3, followed by knight a4, and it almost seems impossible to defend this pawn. It's true that black has the two bishops, and our king might be a little weak, but it doesn't seem like black can take advantage of it too easily. So if you like to play very positionally and just win a pawn and grind your opponent down, this is a way to do that. But if you prefer to keep the pressure on and the tension, you can play rook b1. And then play d3 and e3. So rook b8. Okay, and if f5, after b5, e4 is good, so simply knight ge2 to defend this knight. C is Zynex. Okay. So rook b8, knight ge2 to defend the knight, bishop e6, and now b5. Okay, and if d5 here, by the way, to try to free his position. Unfortunately, this knight is misplaced, so this doesn't work, because take. Okay, so we can't take the knight yet because our rook is hanging. But if we castle, then this knight is trapped, so he has to go b6. And now after take, knight c3, this knight will dominate this bishop, because white's next two moves will be e4 and knight d5. And then this knight will be super knight, this bishop will be bad, and this pawn will be strong. And these pawns are all terrible. a7, a5, and c5 are all terrible. Okay, so anyway, let's go back to move 12. So b6. Castle, Knight b7 to get the knight back into the game. And then e4, king h8. Queen c1, f5, and bishop g5. Queen e8, and now a typical motif here. Exchange this bishop for this knight so that we can reinforce our control of d5. So we take, and then we take on f5. So black should take with the pawn. And then, of course, whenever black takes with the pawn here, as we learned from previous videos, we play f4 immediately. And this should be okay for white. But black actually took with the bishop, which was a mistake. Because after knight d5, queen d7, queen d2, this knight is a monster. So knight a5, knight ec3, rook b8, knight e4, knight b7, a4, knight a5, and h4. And eventually white prepared the move f4 and won the game. Okay, so that's this line with e5. So now let's look at a5. So this move seems to make a lot of sense, right? Because now black is clamping down on our ability to play b4. Okay, but the problem with it is that it weakens this square b5. So now as white, we need to kind of realize that our queenside play will not be fruitful. So instead, we're going to just try to exploit the fact that this b5 square is weak. So no point in playing rook b1 anymore. We're not going to play b4 ever. So we're just going to develop knight f3. Okay. So now black has 4 things he can try. He can try d6. He can try e5. Try e6. Or he can try knight f6. So on d6, we just castle. Okay, e5 again, a Botvinnik. So we're going to hop our knight into d5. So we're going to go this way. e1, c2, e3, d5. So e1, c2. Typical idea. Castle. Knight e3. Rook b8. Okay, always useful move d3. Bishop d2. Knight d4. Oh, sorry, he played b5 actually here. So if black tries b5, it's probably not going to be a good idea because after knight takes. Now, rather than this knight coming to d5, it can actually come to c4 to put pressure on d6 pawn. And so after queen c7, knight takes b5, rook takes b5, a4. White actually just won a pawn here because now a5 is falling. So this is good for white. Okay. So now let's look at what happens on e5. So again, this could transpose, but there's another interesting idea here. So again, if you want to be a little bit crazy, we can play this move d4. So this looks insane because black has 4 pieces on this pawn and we only have 2. Of course, if you want to be more sane, you can just simply play castle, knight g7, and knight e1, and this will transpose after d6. Okay, but if you want to play a little crazy, nothing wrong with a little d4 in your life. So c takes d4, knight b5, trying to take advantage of this square. And then, so d6, e3. And notice he can't take this pawn because of knight takes d6. So bishop g4, h3, and then you take with the bishop. Bishop f4 to attack this pawn again. Bishop h6 to stop castling. And now queen d2. So black tries a4 to clamp down these pawns. And then he's trying to go for b3, pinning the bishop. And now all of a sudden white's pieces are monsters. Because knight takes h6, bishop takes b7, And if rook b8, bishop c6 check, followed by queen takes c4, this knight's hanging at the end. But he tries to castle, and he takes an a8, d5 to defend the knight. And white is close to winning here. Okay, so again, that's an interesting try, but if it's not for you, then the simple castling is fine. Okay, so what happens on e6? So again, now on e6, we can actually play d4. Because whenever this square d6 is undermined, we always have this idea in this position. So d4. So knight takes would be forced here. If c takes, knight b5, e5, e3 wins the pawn back. Because again, d takes e3, queen d6 is crushing. And so white's going to get a good position and the pawn back. Okay, so we're going to look at knight takes d4, which is probably the only thing black can do. Take with the pawn. Take with the bishop, by the way. Then knight b5 again, threatening this knight d6 and also attacking the bishop. And if bishop e5, again bishop g7 loses to queen d6. And now bishop e3 hitting this pawn. Queen b6, f4, bishop b8, and b4. Very powerful initiative here for white. This pawn is pinned, and he has all his pieces developed. Okay, so after knight d4, cd4, knight b5, queen b6. And now not e3, because black actually has d5 here, but queen a4. So now, of course, d5 is impossible because of double checks. So, for example, knight e7, bishop f4 threatening deadly knight c7. So e5 to block it. And now c5, with the point that after queen takes c5, rook c1, and now knight c7 is coming, and black is lost. And now black is lost. Okay, so now let's look at the fourth option in this position, which is knight f6. And now this square d4 is under white's control, so simply d4, take, and d6. Simply castle, and queen d3, and this is good for white. This bishop is doing great work on this b7 pawn, so it's hard to develop this guy. Notice that black's normal source of counterplay in this position would be b5, but it's almost impossible because he already had played a5. So this is a good version of like a Maroczy bind, basically. This is a real good version of the Maroczy bind. Okay, so now let's look at d6 on move 5 instead of a5. Yeah, so a5 is not good. No, it's not. But a lot of people will play it because they'll try to stop b4. So it's a very natural move by black, but no, it's not very good. Okay, so now d6. So this is more solid because it keeps control of this d6 square. Notice that these e6 and e5 moves lose control of d6, but d6 is more flexible and solid. Okay, so now we can't play b4, unfortunately, because the dark squares aren't weak, so we have to play rook b1 here. Okay, and now black can play a5, actually, because with this move d6 in, it's much more solid. Okay, black can also choose to not stop this move with, say, knight f6, but here, as white, we play the move knight h3. And the idea is, we want to play knight f4 and knight d5. So if e5, for example, d3, and we'll continue with this move f4. If, say, knight h5 to try to stop knight f4, then maybe d3, castle, knight f4, take, bishop takes, h6, queen c1, king h7, and b4. So queen c1 was like a dual idea. Attack h6 and defend c3. And here again, white has the play on the queen side, and it's probably slightly better. Okay, so say black plays bishop e6 instead, knight f6. Another sensible move. But still d3 to defend this pawn, queen d7, bishop d2 to defend this knight, so we can play b4. Knight f6, b4, rook c8, and knight g5. And now this bishop on e6 looks a bit awkward. So we're going to try to take the two bishops if we can. And so we're going to keep chasing this bishop. Okay, so now this knight's trapped, so he's going to play h6. Now we play knight takes f7, cute move. So after king takes, fg4, queen g4, we go into an endgame. But after a castle check and knight d5, white can either play on the queen side or on the king side. We have the open f file for the king side and two bishops, or we can also play on the queen side and try to maybe play b5, a4, a5. Okay, so that's an idea there. So a5 is the most natural, and now it's not nearly as bad as it was in the previous variations. So knight f3, e5, castle, knight g7, d3. So knight e1 is possible. The knight e1, c2, e3 idea is possible, but d3, castle. Okay, and if bishop e6, the point is knight g5. So by delaying this knight e1 move, we allow ourselves for this additional idea. So castle, and then bishop g5. Okay. So white's idea here is he wants to take on e7 and play knight d5. So for example, if h6, take, so knight takes to control d5 makes more sense. If queen takes, then again we're going to play knight e1, knight c2, knight e3, and knight d5. But okay, assume he takes with a knight. And then knight e1, rook b8, knight c2, bishop e6, b4. Knight e3 is also possible, by the way. But b4 makes sense too, so ab, ab. Okay, so if ab, knight b4, again we're getting to d5 just from a different square. So let's say black tries d5 himself. So maybe knight e3 might be more accurate, but this is interesting too because we just exchange a lot on d5. And by a lot, I mean a lot. Okay, knight e3, gain a tempo. Queen a4, ab4, and rook b4. And now notice black has this super weakness on b7. And white should be able to probably win this pawn by force. And the knight should be better in a bishop in a endgame where the pawns are on the same side of the board. So white is better here for sure. Yeah, so this is good for white. So instead, black probably has to play this move f6 to stop this idea. And now bishop e3. And now we're putting pressure on the c5 pawn. So it's hard for black to get d5 in, so he'll probably have to play b6 first. So the bishop looks a bit awkward on e3, but we're trying to force a b6 idea and weakening this diagonal, this g2, a8 diagonal. Okay, if black ever plays f5, we just return back to g5 with our bishop. So say bishop e6, and now knight e1, knight c2, b3, take, take. Okay, so we give ourselves this isolated a pawn, but we have pressure on b7, and we're going to soon play bishop d2 to clear a square for our knight and play knight e3 and knight d5. And so white is solid here. Okay, now let's look at the final variation, which is knight f6. Okay, so this, it's a sensible developing move. Again, b4 won't quite work out here. So we have to play rook b1. Okay, a5 again to stop b4. If castle, then b4 basically lets us get our plan off unhindered. a5 to try to create a square on b4. And here, rather than playing b5, simply b takes a5 is probably simplest, with the idea that white's pawn structure is better, this pawn is isolated, and we have pressure on this b7 pawn. Because if we play b5, for example, then knight b4, queen b3, d5 takes, and bishop f5, and now this is getting messy all of a sudden. This is getting messy. So b takes a5 seems simplest. b5 looks logical, but now black is starting to get his pieces in the game. And our king is still ways away from castling. Okay, so a5, knight h3, again, similar idea. We're going to go knight f4, knight d5. So castle, knight f4, d6, castle rook b8. So if bishop d7, for example, then so we're trying to trade bishops here. Take back with the pawn to open up the b file. And after rook b2, queen e2, and rook b1, white has, again, strong pressure on the b file. This b pawn is always going to be the target. Okay, so instead of bishop d7, rook b8 to provide some relief, d3, bishop d7, and bishop d2. Okay, so knight e8 is the best try here. If knight a7 to try to play b5 and get rid of this weakness, then we can open up the b file first with b4, ab4, cb4, rook b5, or rook b4, b5, and then we can win a pawn here with this cute move, queen a1, because we're hitting the knight. So knight c6, rook b5, rook b5, cb5, knight d4, and simply queen a6. Now we're just going to try to promote this pawn. Okay, but knight e8 is actually a good try from black, because he's probably close to equalizing in this position after take, knight d5, queen d8, and knight c3. Okay, so we're trying to put the clamp on b5. But similarly, black's put the clamp on b4. So it's not really clear what white should be doing here. Maybe e3 and trying to play d4 at some point. But yeah, this is pretty close to equal here. So there's two final lines we have to look at, because remember I said there were 8. So we're going to look at b6 now, which is trying to counter white's bishop with his own. So the idea is he's going to try to play bishop b7, queen c8, and then knight d4, and then try to exchange bishops that way. So e3 to keep a clamp on d4. Okay, so he can try knight a5 here to just trade the bishops off. But now b4 looks good. And after castle, castle, d5, take. So we don't want to take back and lose our bishop, but queen b3 to defend. Now d4, c takes, a takes, knight d6, and b5. And now we have this isolated pawn on b5, but it's difficult to attack, and this pawn on a7 is now fixed, so it's a backward pawn on an open file. And white has a strong center, 2 central pawns to black's 1, and he can use the c6 square potentially for his pieces. So white should be better here. And finally, this knight h6 move. So if you want to be combative, you can play b4, but sensible would probably just be rook b1. then a5, e3, e3 to control d4, and to get your knight out. So we're going to fianchetto, because again, once we play e3, it's not going to come out this way. So after bishop d7, castle, rook b8, knight b5, take, knight e5, and knight ec3. And white should be better here, because both d4 and b4 are coming in the near future. So white should be better here as well. Okay, so that is the entirety of the symmetrical variation. Let me go do one more thing with you guys before I let you go, which is the Rubinstein variation, which is marked by knight f6 and d5. Okay, so it's kind of similar to the dragon, except the reverse dragon, except black's played c5 instead of e5. So the character of the position is a little different. So again, we're going to play knight c3. And here, the Rubinstein idea in this position was knight c7. So his idea was to get his knight to d4. So he wants knight e6, knight c6, and then clamp on d4. So let me just show you guys quickly this variation, and then I'll answer your questions. Okay, so if he takes on c3, for example, it's kind of resembles a Grunfeld in a way, but notice how we haven't played d4 yet, so it gives us some additional options. So g6, rook b1. Okay, so now we're actually threatening to play rook takes b7 and or bishop takes b7. Not quite yet, but queen e5 is an issue, but okay, so queen c7. Knight h3 again. So knight h3 to not block the bishop, but also to control d5. Because notice from h3 we get to d5 in 2 squares, whereas from f3 it takes us 4 moves. We have to go like knight e1, c2, e3. So h3 is often the preferred square in these positions, so we can control d5 more easily. Okay, so h4, h5, h6, and after bishop e5, knight d5, and this looks actually good for white. He's not castled, but black's king is probably less safe than white's king at the moment, because 2 central pawns covering the king is actually enough for white to feel comfortable. Okay, if e6, simply winning a pawn with take and queen b3 seems good. So for example, if bishop e6, queen b7, knight d7, and again knight h3, should just win a pawn. And if knight c6, then we take on d5. And it looks like black can get some compensation with knight b4 forking c2 and d5, but bishop e4 and bishop b1. And again, it seems like black is down a pawn for not much at all. After bishop a2, bishop b7, castle. So black is just down a pawn for nothing. Some guy named Vladimir Kramnik played black here. Okay, so knight b6, trying to do a similar idea to what we saw in the dragon, the reverse dragon lines. But unfortunately the knight's badly placed here after a4. Knight c6, a5, so we're chasing the knight all over the place. And now white just turns on the pressure, because after d3, e5, so trying to block bishop f4 ideas, we don't care, and we play f4 anyway. So bishop d6, knight f3, castle, knight b5, castle, and knight g5, queen c4 threatening f7 calamities, and now knight takes f7, cute move. So after knight takes d6, queen takes d6, queen takes f7, and here black resigned. Because king takes f7, this is check. And so white won the exchange here, because we're winning the queen back for nothing. Okay. So that was a quick 18 move miniature. Okay, so if the knight tries to go to b4, it's even worse probably. Because the knight is not really good here. Because the knight wants to probably be back on c7 anyway, so it's actually just going to waste 2 tempi to do it. So simple development. So he plays e5 to control d4. Knight d2, knight c7. Okay, so now a common idea also in this opening is to ruin black's pawn structure. Because after this, black's pawns are falling pretty much. And this is a good position for white. Okay, so now let's go back to the main line, which is this knight c7 move. Okay, so we're going to play knight f3, and we're going to castle. Okay. So e5, again, most natural to kind of play a Maroczy bind reversed in a way. Clamp it on d4. So knight e1, again, going for this idea of knight c2, knight e3, knight d5. And here, black usually plays a move like bishop d7 in order to stop a threat of bishop takes c6. Because if he doesn't play bishop d7, then we can take on c6 and play d3, queen a4, similar to what I showed you before. So if bishop d7, now knight to d3, threatening to simply take on c6, take on e5, so f6. Bishop d6 is worse, by the way, because now I can win the bishop pair by force after knight e4. And queen e7 is to defend this pawn. And then I can just take my time before I decide I want to take that bishop. So castle, bishop e2, rook c1, improving all my pieces. f4, and now I will take it. And then take it. Oops, it's not d3, but e3. And then after bishop f5, trying to exploit the light squares, we can actually play this cute move, take on g7, and then knight h5, and then this bishop is falling, and white's much better here, because after queen takes d2, queen takes d2, rook takes d2, we simply take on c6, and rook cf1, and all of a sudden black's losing all his pawns. So, okay. So f6 is the main move. Okay, so now we're going to fiend counter this bishop probably. b3, bishop b7, f4, and now we're threatening to take here, so he pretty much has to capture. Because otherwise black gets an isolated pawn on e5, and it should be very good for white, so capturing is obligatory. We capture, castle, and bishop b2. Okay. So this is pretty much the tabia for this line, the main position. So all of white's minor pieces look good here. We have the open f file, the open c file. But our pawn structure is worse, right? We have 3 pawn islands, we have 2, 2, and 2. And black has 3 and 3. So we have these hanging pawns on the the E and D files. So if black can successfully harmonize his pieces and get rooks on the D and E files, he should probably be better, but it seems unlikely that black will be able to do that. So there's a couple of things white can try here. White can try just to play brute force e3, bishop d5, queen h5, just try to checkmate. Or e3, queen e2, and rook a d1. And then just try to play d4, d5, d6. Just try to ram the d pawn down black's throat. So I'll just show you one sample game. So e3. So again, two ideas here. One is to play queen h5 and just try to checkmate. Another one is just play queen e2 and d4. So after bishop d6, knight c d5, queen e8, and now black's actually already lost because after knight e5, the spectacular rook takes f6, and then bishop g4, and I'll just show you guys the cute finish. Knight takes g7, and again, none of these pieces can be taken. So queen d7, queen c2, king takes g7, rook takes, queen takes, knight takes, queen takes, and bishop takes. And white's winning. Okay guys, so that's going to be it for this installment.